Hello, hello, hello. All right, welcome, folks. We are about to begin our next installment of SIECUS Online. It is wonderful to have you all joining us. We are going to give ourselves about 5 minutes to get started. We have quite a number of folks who are registered for tonight's event, so we want to give everyone a little bit of time to be able to log on and join. So sit tight. We are so glad that you are here. There is a ton of stuff happening right now, and so this conversation feels even more urgent and necessary to understand what's going on and who's behind attacks on our country. So I hope you're ready, because we are. Welcome, welcome. We are about to launch our next SIECUS Online. Yes, this is being recorded, and we will share the recording with everyone. Feel free to use the chat if you'd like to introduce yourselves. Let us know where you're joining from. It's always really fun to see where around the world folks are hailing from. We're excited to have you all here. We're going to start in about 2 minutes because this is going to be a 1-hour program. We have a lot we want to talk about. We also want to make sure that you all have an opportunity to ask any questions and receive information and support from our panelists. So we will begin at 7:35 p.m. Eastern. And I'm going to go on mute because there's some background noise here. Hey, Wendy. It is always good to see you. Alicia, that's such good team spirit. We are so glad to have partnered with the Human Rights Campaign as well. So thank you for being here, for being a part of this endeavor. It is work, work, work. All right. Okay, it is 7:35 p.m. Eastern. We are going to go ahead and get started so that we can hit the ball rolling and have important conversations that we want to have. Thank you all so much for joining SIECUS and this program. Taking a deep breath because there's a lot going on. First of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Chris Harley. I'm the president and CEO of SIECUS, Sex Ed for Social Change. As you know, SIECUS Online is a series of virtual armchair discussions that we have been using to explore how sex education can be a vehicle for social change with leading experts in the field. SIECUS Online really is an effort to lift up important topics and to discuss them, raise attention to them, and make sure that as misinformation campaigns prevail at the moment, that we are putting forward fact-based, evidence-based information. Let me start off by going over some housekeeping items just so that we are all operating from the same page. We are using a Zoom webinar, which means that all participants are muted and video cameras are turned off, but you are free to use the chat and the chat function per usual. This can be seen by all audience members, or you could just chat with the speakers. We expect that everyone on here will behave respectfully to our invited speakers and to attendees within the chat, or you will be removed from the event. There is also a question and answer box that we invite you to submit questions to. These are moderated by SIECUS, and we will pull from these at the end of the event to make sure that we can solicit opportunities for you all to engage with our speakers. We will do our best to answer as many questions as we can, but if we're not able to do so, we'll capture those and try to respond to them via email. This webinar is being recorded. It will be made available to everyone who registered for the event, and then we will also post the recording on the SIECUS website and on our YouTube channel. And we expect that this recording will be made available publicly early next week. SIECUS Online was originally intended as a pandemic fundraiser for SIECUS, so thank you for your support and for joining us through this series. We are now offering these events for free, but we do invite you to visit siecus.org/donate, make a contribution so that we can continue to fight the good fight to advance comprehensive sex ed policies and programs around the country. Just quickly about SIECUS, we were founded in 1964 to lead on shame-free sex education and to champion sexual and reproductive freedom. Now we are asserting that sex education is a powerful vehicle for social change. We are the only national organization that is solely focused on advocating for the rights of all people to accurate information, comprehensive sex education, policy, and the full spectrum of sexual and reproductive health services as an advocacy organization. And we think that sex education plays a key role at the intersection of movements like racial justice, LGBTQ rights, sexual violence prevention, and urgent conversations around consent and healthy relationships. And tonight's event is focused directly on how all of those intersections are lining up right now. So welcome to Exposing Hate, the truth about attacks on kids, schools, and diversity. This week, it feels like the religious conservative movement has just taken a big step forward in rolling our country back more than 50 years as it relates to reproductive rights, LGBTQ people, trans individuals, people of color. And it feels like we're really in a key moment in our country, and it feels a little bit draconian, a little bit dystopian in terms of what our future could look like. So tonight, we are going to focus on the current battles that are being fought in our public education system, connect the dots between these attacks, and really focus on how to identify opportunities to fight back against the regressive minorities' hurtful, hate-based agenda. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. We've got some amazing speakers. Thank you all for joining us. Allison Macklin is our State Policy and Advocacy Director at SIECUS, who is leading the fight to advance comprehensive sex ed. She is a national leader for more than 18 years and also is an author of a book on sex education for kids. Kristen Penner is the research fellow at the African American Policy Forum. Her work centers on visual mapping of networks and infrastructure behind the anti-affirmative action and critical race theory activist in right-wing campaigns, and is the co-founder and board member of the Coalition for a Diverse Harvard. Courtney Avon serves as the legislative counsel at the Human Rights Campaign, focusing on federal and state advocacy in handling a range of issues, including criminal justice, voting rights, and LGBTQ youth. Crystal Lett is the Ohio Program Director of Red, Wine, and Blue, an organization that equips and mobilizes more than 300,000 suburban women in the political space. She has been a tireless community advocate and even ran for the Ohio Senate District 16 in the 2020 cycle, and has been bringing that political prowess to Red, Wine, and Blue and to moms around the country. And then finally, we have Lizette Trujillo, who is a mommy advocate for trans youth and their families. She's a small business owner and a member of HRC PTEC and Saga. So thank you all again so much for being here, for joining us, for being willing to speak out about what's going on, and for being on the front lines of this fight. So to get us started, my first question is directed at Allison and Kristen. Who is the regressive minority? What do they believe, and why is it important for us to expose who they are and what they stand for?
Well, Kristen, I can jump in here if you want. So the regressive minority is a very loud and vocal minority of Americans who are basically living in fear. There are individuals who've become accustomed to a certain privilege in society, and they're really scared about losing that privilege. As they see their control diminishing, they're acting out. So groups who oppose comprehensive sex education, this regressive minority, really work hard to incite a moral panic in their audience. They create misleading and fabricated versions of what comprehensive sex education. And we see that this type of strategy of employing emotionally charged language really feeds into nationalist movements. So specifically the Christian nationalist movement, and in some cases, even supported by white nationalist movements. They are often referred to as parental rights movements. Really, sorry, my children are yelling at my dogs. But the position, but really what there really is, this distorted propaganda is feeding into their narrative. And so while this might look like a grassroots movement on the surface, they're really well organized and very well funded. And to be clear, like, this isn't just an attack on comprehensive sex education. This is really an attack on public education, an attack on truth and history, and really what is real and what's reality in this world. So we know that there's lots of organizations, coalitions, large donors with lots of amount of money going into this Christian nationalist movement, really working hard to further propagate their hate and their fear-based regressive beliefs in the United States. They use language like parental rights, divisive concepts, protecting women's sports. And they use this language really to, again, incite this moral panic. And they've been successful in some of that language, really with the bills that they're trying to run at the state level, whether they're engaging at school boards. But I think the other piece to really remember is that these individuals aren't opposed to history, for example. They're not opposed to sex education. This is really about forcing their ideals and their ideology on other people. So when they want history to be taught, they want it to be their history. When they are teaching about sex education, they're teaching about abstinence only until marriage or sexual risk reduction. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, because really this is about their version versus what's real, what's factual, what research shows is really going to be effective. Um, and I want to let Kristen talk, but I think when I talk about these well organized and well funded movements, there's really three big funnels that push out, whether it's policy, whether it's another parent group popping up here, there, everywhere. We need to really hone in on the fact that these organizations or these grassroots movements are really being supported behind the scenes by larger organizations like the Family Policy Alliance, the Heritage Foundation, and the Alliance Defending Freedom. So these organizations, the Family Policy Alliance, for example, was once a part of Focus on the Family Action. Then they turned to Citizen Link. Then they rebranded once again to Family Policy Alliance. The Heritage Foundation, it's one of the most influential conservative think tanks in the United States. And then the Alliance Defending Freedom is a conservative Christian nonprofit legal interest group that advocates for regressive hate-based agenda. So I think it's really important to name those organizations, name who's behind this movement, so that we can really dispel some of the smoke screens that are being put up in our local communities.
Absolutely. Maybe I can jump in here at this point. I think, my work began, as was mentioned, I started a small nonprofit, which was really about kind of defending diversity in higher education in the affirmative action space. When Harvard was targeted by Edward Bloom, the man behind not just a series of anti-affirmative action lawsuits, but he's also the person behind Shelby County v. Holder, which is the lawsuit which really eviscerated the Voting Rights Act and has led to a lot of the voter suppression that we're seeing today. I sort of began trying to connect the dots in a sort of digital version of kind of the push pins on a bulletin board fashion to really map out these connections. And what I found was that it's sort of like the Goliath behind the Davids, is what I would like to say. A lot of these folks, whether it's these small groups of parents in local areas that are supposedly grassroots, but have shockingly high budgets and resources and access to legal help or social media accounts, et cetera, or whether it's someone like Edward Bloom, who seems to be just in a one-man war, or Christopher Rufo, again in a one-man war against CRT and now LGBTQ inclusive education, et cetera, that they're really getting this funded by the same folks. And I think it is a broad attack on public education. It's also an attack on education as a key institution of our multiracial democracy. And they've depended upon things like eviscerating the Voting Rights Act to blunt voter responses to the actions that they're taking. So it's, I've really been trying to look into this infrastructure, map it out visually, and I found that this right-wing network is like a think tanks, donors, lawyers, judges, justices, and there's this very wide scope of attacks that they're launched. It's against reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, civil rights advances across the board, suppressing the vote, as I said. And it's also connected to derailing efforts to combat climate change, which doesn't often get connected up into this. But environmental justice is also a racial justice issue. A lot of the very few families that have actually the family foundations that fund these organizations like the Heritage Foundation via Donors Trust and other ways in which their money has been anonymized in our system now. It's really 5 to 10 families, a lot of whom did get their money in, the fossil fuel area. I think the role of the courts in this is just incredibly important. I don't know if any of you have followed the work of Senator Sheldon Whitehouse on this, but he has really been kind of tirelessly trying to shout to anyone who will listen about the attack on our judicial system that is allowing for all of this. And so there's been hundreds of millions of dollars funneled into the Federalist Society and many of Federalist Society affiliated lawyers are supporting these parents' rights groups, or there's kind of a whole network. That many of them clerked for the conservative justices. That's a very important piece of this as well. And the other thing I just wanted to say was that this side, there's also the think tanks that are involved in all of this are connected via something called the State Policy Network, which is the policy arm of ALEC, which is kind of the bill mill that is allowing for there to be such fast copycat legislation related to CRT, abortion bans, and it's just that state level infrastructure is something that's really missing on our side. The other thing that's very different about this Koch donor network is that it's really designed to manufacture social change, and it's very vertically integrated. So they're funding very small organizations all the way up to large institutions, and they're also funding across issue areas. And that's why it's just so important that we connect all these different issues so that we're not kind of playing whack-a-mole and exhausting ourselves in the process. We have to see this bigger picture if we're going to fight for our democracy, if we're going to fight for public education and for very specific issues like sex education, which is so intertwined with our reproductive freedom, with racial justice, with all of these other issues that are so critical.
And I just wanted to follow up. Thank you so much, Kristen, for calling out the policies. I mean, you're absolutely right. We have seen a major uptick in the policies. So last year we saw a number of bills being tried out with language. And according to our tracking, we saw a 413% increase from 2021 in divisive concept and parental rights types of bills. So just with that type of language, which is kind of mind-boggling. And when you look at the different bills that are being run in each state, there are some just verbatim, word for word, the same bill that has just been copy and pasted and being tried out in different states. So it really is something to be aware of.
Another element of that is that they're kind of reinforcing one another, so that, it was so shocking when there was kind of the whole bounty private cause of action elements to the Texas anti-abortion law. And that is now being replicated, for example, in the anti-CRT bills and laws that we're seeing moving across the country. And so there's just, these things are reinforcing one another, and it's also, as they add to it, and I think, more issues get kind of pulled in and it can reinforce one another. A lot of the the restrictions on LGBTQ inclusive education were really languishing until there was the wave of the anti-CRT bills, and then that repopularized that. So it's very troubling how it's kind of interacting with one another.
Thank you, to both of you. And I agree. I've started to just think about this as the spaghetti on the wall. And I do feel like there's also this element of renaming and rebranding that keeps happening, because we have to remember how universally rejected these ideas are, right? And so, we do see these conservative thought leaders appropriating more liberal language to try to hide what their endeavors are. I saw a remark about like they keep using the words like family and freedom, but there's definitely a lot of spaghetti that's being thrown against the wall right now. And I wanted to ask Courtney and Kristen, what you see the connections are between these various attacks, right? It's critical race theory. It's comprehensive sex education. It's, trans youth playing in sports. Or using the bathroom. It's talking about sex, or don't say gay in school. There's book bans. There's people are also mobilizing against face masks in school. So like, what's the unifying, or how do we understand these various spaghetti attacks and the ways in which they're encouraging grassroots parents to mobilize and to turn out, you know, for meetings or protests? Can you help us connect these thoughts? Because I worry sometimes that, you know, in that we get real siloed in thinking about this is our issue and this is the attack, and it feels like it's just everything across the wall.
Sure, I'm kind of happy to jump in here. So we've actually gotten to touch on a lot of this already, and I think that it bears repeating. What we're seeing in a lot of these attacks is that they have a common thread. A lot of them are being disseminated under the guise of parental rights. And we know what these efforts are actually about, but what lawmakers and members of the regressive minority want parents to think is something completely different. It sounds very inoffensive, but I mean, because it's very difficult to find a parent or a guardian who's like, oh yeah, of course, I shouldn't have any say in my kids' upbringing or education. That is completely intentional. And I think, as we kind of touched on earlier, these attacks are about censorship. They're about allowing right-wing ideology to shape education. Frankly, it's the type of ideology that blatantly discriminates against people based on race or gender, sexual orientation, etc. And we have seen this before in the 60s and the 70s. Extremist groups were calling sex education a communist plot, which I just find absolutely insane. And then there was a moral crisis. And even today, lawmakers are trying to make it really difficult to pass good sex ed bills that let you talk about HIV and AIDS. So it's not like we haven't heard this type of anti-progressive rhetoric before. And what's interesting now is that it's that same type of language, the kind that creates, as we said earlier, a moral panic that's being used to justify these measures. And they're anti-critical race theory or divisive concepts, like whatever buzzword Republicans are coming up with nowadays. They're anti-trans, they ban books, they stop schools from talking about LGBTQ plus people in history. This is just an obvious attempt at a culture war. And it's animating the GOP base in a way that it's supposed to. And it's ignoring the obvious for the outrageous, is what I like to say. We know that comprehensive sex ed is good. Like, we know that CRT is not actually being taught in classrooms. We know that reading books about gay penguins doesn't turn you gay. This is actually a sign to please read And Tango Makes Three. It's a very cute book and I recommend it. I mean, so again, like, while there's nuance to these types of bills and what they're attacking, what they all have in common is, one, this is a concerted effort by the collection of right-wing donors and organizations that we talked about. And two, they make schools very unsafe places, especially for LGBTQ plus students and young trans athletes and students of color, students who are economically disadvantaged. And so I think, kind of to summarize, they're purposefully flaming outrage and creating a panic, and it's sending the base flocking to the polls. And that's exactly what they want to do.
Yeah, and I think it's such a good point that this is not something new. I mean, this is a backlash following the massive multiracial protests after the murder of George Floyd, and where a lot of people demonstrated that they understood systemic racism was a real thing. This is after, I mean, and these folks have done this before, as mentioned. And I think a lot of these organizations, like the Heritage Foundation, it was really created they at a time following like the integration of our schools, and that has kind of, they have been soft pedaling their ideologies in different ways to appeal to different people, and they've been able to test it out in their messaging throughout this kind of broad network across in different states, in different areas. And I think part of what we have to do is get very smart about our own messaging. And so to speak to parents that do want to have a say in an emotionally authentic, connected way, naming this as a racist ideology that's, and what's the money that's behind it, exposing that. And when we do that, we can see some successes. There were a few weeks ago, there were some successes in local school board races across New Hampshire where parents recognize that these expensive pamphlet campaigns in their districts meant that there was this sort of outside extremist agenda happening, going on in their race. And when the parents who actually said to who actually had been on the school boards, who had children in the schools, asked the question, like, where are you from? Do you have a kid at this, school, et cetera? It exposed what was going on. And I think we have seen some successes with that, and with kind of bringing people together across the country to kind of develop our own messaging that's equally powerful and authentic for parents, and that doesn't fall into the traps of blaming wokeness or saying we shouldn't be naming this as a racial justice issue. I think one of the other things that we really need to demand is that our media, the liberal media, not fall into the trap of always talking about this as a both sides issue. It's something that we just keep seeing over and over, and kind of conflating things that, like trying to improve the curriculum is not the same thing as banning books or other things like that. There's been a whole cancel culture moral panic that has really been stoked by our progressive media as well. So I guess the other piece is just that when we, of our kind of how our messaging can be different, I think, is if we can really speak up about all of the different issues when we're talking about one specific one, like tonight. I think it's just really critical that we acknowledge, we try to make visible this Goliath that we're up against as much as we possibly can.
Kristen, that was such a great teeing up for the next question. Particularly, Lizette, I want to invite you into the conversation now, and Allison. There's a lot going on. Lizette, you have a really clear understanding of the intersectionality of how these attacks show up in schools, having been a parent who's had to, fight back on behalf of your own child and young people in your community. Allison as well. As you have experienced and observed these attacks, how do we push back? How do we talk about the need to make sure that all young people have access to comprehensive sex education? Because if we do sex education right, we are doing sex education that is inclusive, affirming, and respectful of all young people's identities and experiences. That's the world I think that most parents want their kids to be raised in, to be brought into. But in speaking about messaging and being clear, how do we show up and talk affirmatively about sex education and the need for inclusive programs in school environments for our young people?
I first want to say, I want to thank Kristen, and Courtney for bringing up really important points. This ultimately goes back to defunding public schools, which began when public schools were desegregated. And so it's much like when you're talking about structural racism, because it's like the invisible enemy, people have a really difficult time connecting the dots. So I'm in Arizona. Alliance Defending Freedom is an hour and 45 minutes away from my home. But what was really interesting for me is that all these players were participating in a sex ed fight that was occurring within one of the largest school districts. So I'll just lay the foundation for you really quickly. In 1991, Arizona put in place a policy that then became known as the No Promo Homo, which did not allow you to speak about LGBTQIA people within the context of sex ed, but it became extremely pervasive. And so teachers were afraid to be out. This law was in the books for over 20 years. People forget, it's very reminiscent to Don't Say Gay, right? And so in 2019, this law was challenged by NCLR and a few other legal organizations, and Governor Ducey signed it out. But Focus on the Family, which became Family Watch International, which was tied to Alliance Defending Freedom, which was also tied to the Center for Arizona Policy. We can name all the players. We're already working with local religious organizations who were going around to churches and communities, sharing videos about the gender incongruent ideology that we were going to try to push down children's throats. And it was a very horrible anti-trans video, and they were showing it throughout our community without people really understanding. They had also placed one of their key players on the organizing committee that was helping write or revise the sex ed programming for this large school district. So they have their hands in all spaces. And I, as a parent, had no idea what I was walking into or how well funded it was. What I want to tell people is that they are extremely well funded and they understand race dynamics, racial dynamics. So they saw that 2 of the organizing parents were 2 Latinx people. And so they organized local Latinx churches and bust them out to say this is actually racist and goes against our own very culture and understanding of who we are. So they understand mirroring and racial dynamics. They're very savvy when they're preparing for how to distract families and create what Courtney called a culture war at the local level. So this isn't new. This was one of the very many ways in which they tried to make something look grassroots. This was 2019. We've also seen, not far from me, was where the principal was almost zip tied. They were busing Parents for Purple down to Vail, which is 2 hours away from them, and going in and trying to insert their own people onto school boards. And so I think it's, when you're asking about messaging, as I just went on a long rant about this, it really is just connecting the dots for parents and telling them this really has nothing to do with books. This has nothing to do with, inclusive sex ed. Really what they want to do is continue to marginalize people who have been disenfranchised for a very long time. And they want to make sure that they can scare parents who will then choose voucher systems or charter schools or private schools so that they can continue to defund and dismantle the public school system so that redlining and segregation can continue, but in a more invisible and insidious way.
Wow, so powerful. Crystal, I also want to invite you into this. And Red, Wine, and Blue has, been on the front lines of really, hearing from parents and responding to the kinds of, pop-up attacks happening. And I wonder if you can also just share some perspective on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think first and foremost, I'm a big storyteller and I just want to absolutely prop up every single person, the things that they've said about these groups, the Heritage Foundation. I was raised in the height of the moral majority in a conservative evangelical home. I knew about the Heritage Foundation before I knew about anything else. My parents got me all the books from Focus on the Family, and actually Focus on the Family developed a lot of books around sex ed that were really just abstinence only, just like you all said. So just want to affirm that the ways that you are talking about and describing the regressive minority are absolutely spot on. I lived through it. I somehow made it out of it. But it was not an easy process. It required a lot of mental health care. It required a lot of therapy, a lot of support from adults that weren't family members who really stood beside me and, kind of shepherded me through that time and those deconstructing periods that I had to go through to kind of make it out to the other side, if you will, for lack of a better term. And so really one of the most wonderful parts of my adult life now is kind of speaking truth to power on the right, on the far right. And that is something that Red, Wine, and Blue has been, laser focused on. We started to see these narratives pop up, the anti-CRT, anti-trans children in sports, anti-mask, anti-vax, all the antis, if you will, in the 2021 election cycle here in Ohio. And we really focused on 16 different school board races and tracked those races and worked to support those candidates who were going up against these extreme right candidates that were propagating this bullshit, for lack of a better term. So when we did that and then measured it against the rest of the nation, we found that 72% of candidates that ran against the extreme right candidates won. So we know that their messaging, their fear tactics, their scare does not actually work, but we also knew that it's really just a message test for the midterms, because for them and now for us, everything's on the line in the 2022 election cycle, from our reproductive freedoms to our ability to have accurate and honest education for our children and so on. So what we really have found by working with candidates, mapping parent groups all over the country, and now we have a website called bookbanbusters.com that literally has mapped all of the book bans in, I think we're up to 48 states now. We have book bans that have either been proposed, they have been implemented, or have been defeated. So it's, it's much more widespread than I think people are tuned into yet. And that's part of what we're trying to do at Red, Wine, and Blue, is call attention. No, this is your state. This is your neighborhood. This is your school district. It is happening. Be on the front lines. And really our goal with, drawing attention to it is to do something in the progressive space that's not us on defense. That's us being offensive, getting out there, calling attention to it before it's threat level midnight and we've lost, another sweeping set of local school board elections and now have to not only undo all of that bad policy that they've implemented, but we now have to go elect other people, then undo. I mean, it's domino after domino of damage that they're doing. And we're not here for that. We want to stop the dominoes from going down to begin with. So what we found is that candidates and parents who address these issues spot on, who call them out, who speak that truth, who do not hide from those issues, they win. And so really the change for us in narrative is not avoiding. We saw lots of politicians do that. The governor's race in Virginia is probably the best example I have of a candidate who did not want to speak on, did not want to speak about these issues, thought they would just go away. They will not. They will just get louder. And the only way that we defeat that is by actually naming it, calling out the lie, and giving the truth. And we've seen that work, and we will continue to see that work, I believe, in the 2022 election cycle.
Thank you so much. I think that's exactly right. And we have seen also with our activists going and speaking, in conservative spaces with conservative legislators, that when we can speak affirmatively and assertively about the power and the value of our young people being taught the skills and information to live respectful, affirming lives for themselves and for their peers, that's what parents want. And so we have to remember that what the agenda they're trying to push right now is super unpopular. And we have to really push back and illuminate what's happening. We are almost out of time I want to be able to move to Q&A from the audience. So anyone who has questions, make sure you're popping it into the Q&A box. My last round robin question for everyone is, how do we fight the regressive minority? We've talked about a couple of different things. What is your last thought for the audience? If the regressive minority shows up and starts, activating parents in your community and town, what do we need to do? I'm going to just go down the list. So I'll start with Allison, and Lizette, you'll be up after that.
Great, thanks. I mean, I think that, Crystal, you said it, that we have to show up. We need to be vocal, and we need to recognize that the folks who are being really loud right now, they are throwing a temper tantrum because they know that they are in the minority. And so they're trying to be as loud as possible. And so we need to help to dismantle the lies that they're spewing. And then we need to also show up just as much as they are. We need to ask the questions. We need to help and help the greater, all of the parents understand that who these people are behind the it's like the Wizard of Oz kind of, who's the person behind the curtain pulling all of the strings. So that's what I would say. And then I think we also need to recognize that just because there's a certain group of folks who are Christian nationalists, or that doesn't mean that that is all Christians. And so inviting folks to speak from their space of faith, and recognizing that the majority of Christians really do want their young people and are teaching their young people to grow up according to the teachings of Jesus, which were around inclusivity, which were around respect, which were around loving thy neighbor. So really going back to that is going to be really critically important.
Thank you. Lizette.
Access to education, it will help us get to equality faster. That's how we invest in our future generations. And so push for policies that will fund your schools in your area. Push for policies that won't allow your state legislatures to continue to defund public education. It's necessary to build strong, thriving communities, and push for a separation of church and state in all public spaces.
Thank you. Crystal.
Yeah, I mean, I very much approach this from a political and an organizing lens. I will say there was a question in the chat. Do these grassroots parents know they're part of this dark money right-wing conspiracy? And I will tell you, they don't. They do not know. And when we, it's that knowledge will set you, or the truth will set you free type of mindset, and knowledge is power. So speak the truth, expose their lies, call them out, and then organize. Show up at your school board meetings. Organize parents to speak at your school board meetings. Dissect the arguments in those speeches, and really show up and vote. I lost my state Senate election by 116 votes, 0.01%. And that's one less legislator that we have in the Ohio State House fighting for all of the things that ideologically we believe are better, and scientifically and data-driven approaches. That's one less person, because 116 votes changed the scope of that and the result of that election. So I know that it gets hard. I know we get exhausted. We're all exhausted, especially after this past week. But, take a breath, get a good night's sleep, drink water, eat food, cry, take another breath, get back out, put one foot in front of the other, and we got to keep going. And we have to make sure that we vote every time, every election.
Absolutely. Courtney.
Hello. Yeah, I'm coming from the exact same standpoint. Organizing is so important. Also, call your representatives. If you can, go to town halls, challenge your legislators, write, protest, donate, volunteer, be extremely annoying to these people as much as possible. And I love what Crystal said about remembering to get a good night's sleep and eat. You have to take care of yourself. Self-care is what all the cool kids are doing nowadays.
Thank you. And then Kristen, to close us out for this, and then we're going to open up for audience Q&A.
Absolutely. What amazing suggestions. And Crystal, I'm just devastated by those few votes, because just hearing you speak, I know what an incredible difference you would have made in the legislature, but you are also making an amazing difference now. At African American Policy Forum, one of the things that we're working with in our Truth Be Told campaign is trying to connect grassroots organizers with thought leaders and at think tanks, people at universities, really trying to kind of bring together Someone was calling it kind of the grass tops and the grass roots, so that we can all be energized by one another, because I think we have to do this in community and solidarity. I think if we can, every time someone talks about one of these issues, we talk about another, we can really make the bigger picture clearer for other folks. And I think another piece that we can just address a little bit is kind of looking at the monetization that these right-wing folks and spokespeople are doing, even with these curriculum that they're, you were just talking about focus on the families, curriculum, that was a money-making enterprise, So I think some of these pieces of information that we can kind of illuminate are helpful, but obviously getting out and voting and being involved in your local community are super key for all of this and essential.
Chris, if I could just say one more thing as well.
Absolutely.
I know that we're talking about huge money wheels, and that can seem overwhelming. And I just want to tell people that we were able to push back, and inclusive sex ed in one of our largest school districts was able to pass because 7 moms, myself included, got together on a Sunday morning, and we put like $300 in a pot and started organizing in our networks and amongst the people we knew. And so I think that while you hear that there's millions of dollars being funded, when you love your community and you're doing what's best for your children, that shines through, and people are able to see how authentic you are. And honestly, parents can move mountains. And so you don't need a lot of money. You just need to buy water for people, and you need to give them talking points. And so don't let that intimidate you when you get into these spaces.
I am so sad that we will be concluding at 8:30 tonight. There was a question in the chat from Irene Park. Is there a particular reason why the regressive minority thinks that promoting healthy choices among young people is a bad thing to teach? How are they framing this to appeal to parents? It's like such a basic, right? Like, why don't we want kids to like know how to like make good decisions for themselves? Go ahead.
So they won't talk directly about not making good choices for your children or sexual health or anything like that. Don't discredit when parents come. I was talking to movement lawyers about parental rights in 2019 because I told them that that was coming. Because that's all I could hear was, it is my parental right. And so the language that they use is truly dog whistles. It was actually really hard on our youth who were hearing things like indoctrination, pedophilia, all the things that we've heard, the recycled language from the anti-LGBTQ movements from before. These parents want to indoctrinate your children, that, all the different ways in which they could scare people, they did. And so they're very savvy. And then at the same time, you're like, I've heard that before so many times. And I think, unfortunately, what we have to keep in mind is what Kristen said. It's a manufactured societal belief. And so if you can get enough people to believe that they are among the minority, then you can oppress them. And that's what happens in these school systems, is that they try to ramp up and bring people over so that they don't feel isolated or feel like they're going to lose on something. And it's a matter of just telling them, actually, a majority of us actually support these policies in our schools, and we need to push back on these tiny few community members that are actually not part of our community.
Yeah. Another question that we received, and feel free to like raise your hand or let me know if you want to respond. How do you dissect problematic arguments against comprehensive sex education when we're living in times where fear-based strategies from the regressive minority seem to be becoming more effective and also, I think, more aggressive? I love me some facts and it makes sense, but how do you deal with folks or situations where facts are not enough, or, they're listening to like alt-right landia where like reality is like warped? I get jaded with this. And that is a question. Actually, I'm not sure who the question is from, but
I can
from
speak
Patricia.
to that. So, I mean, I think that one thing that, as Lizette was saying, that the words that they're using evoke such strong emotion. And so especially when, as a parent, and I'm speaking as a parent, if I hear somebody is calling out, is grooming my child or is a pedophile, like that's strong language. And it's definitely going to catch my attention for sure. Right. So I think what we need to do is, and our movement has been very fact-based because we know science is behind us. But facts aren't what's catching attention anymore. This day is bizarrely new, where we aren't paying attention to science as much as we used to, or we're not, or there's so much false narratives out there just floating around that you can just disseminate false information over and over, whether it's on Facebook or on Twitter or what have you. And so I think what's really going to be important for our movement is to really talk about the values that we hold. And the fact that we really want our children to grow up knowing about diverse families, recognizing that not all people look like us and act like us, and accepting that, and really, and that respect is something that I want my child to learn. Inclusivity is something that I want my child to learn. I want my child to learn the truth about history. And I think that we have for a long time stayed away from that because we didn't want to sound emotional, but we need to be emotional. We need to really hold on to our values, and our values are what the majority wants. And so recognizing that we are unified in that regardless of where we live or come from, we want to raise kids who are kind to one another, who are accepting of one another. So I think we have to really lean heavily into that, more than going to, well, the facts will tell us, even though we have the facts on our side.
If I can just add to that too, I think it's super important that we weave the facts into a story. Something we really emphasize at Red, Wine, and Blue is relational organizing. We know that relational organizing works, and that when people talk to their friends and their neighbors and have these pretty vulnerable conversations at times, especially around these school board issues where you're talking about grooming, with a neighbor or a fellow mom or dad at the PTA meeting, it's really vulnerable. But the way that I have always seen success is to take those facts and incorporate them into a story. So I say, when I was 15, I became sexually active, and I got my sex education from Planned Parenthood because I had an older high schooler who took me to Planned Parenthood, who made an appointment for me, drove me in her car, and got me access to birth control. I was then able to do that for my younger sister when she came of age and was ready to be sexually active. And because we got to write our own stories and decide when it was time for us to be parents, when that worked for our lives, we got to have a story that is purely our own and decide for ourselves who we wanted to be and when and if we wanted to become parents. And we know that when people have access to birth control, abortion, goes down. And that's what the right wants to hear. They want it to be gone. So let them know that abortion goes down when we have access to sex ed, when we have access to birth control and places like Planned Parenthood. All of that kind of weaves in the points, but leaves them remembering the story.
Absolutely. We are at time. This has been such a rich conversation. I am so grateful to all of you for being here, for lifting up and sharing your perspectives on this. I keep going back to the question that was asked, why don't they want our kids to know this? I think that Kristen's point is really accurate. This movement erupted in direct response to the call to join the movement for Black Lives. It comes immediately after a national conversation about how to prevent sexual violence. It comes after our country has overwhelmingly approved and accepted marriage equality for every person who loves another human being in this country. And I think that it is clear also that we have been talking demographically about the shift in our national demography, the demographics of who will make up America. We are increasingly diverse. We are increasingly multiracial. We are increasingly identifying in gender and sexually diverse ways. And it's clear that this is a backlash to hit all of the spaghetti and all of the ways in which the America that we know and love and are leaning into is failing to abide by very regressive, very conservative models of patriarchal control over who gets to have babies, who gets to thrive in America, and who gets to build tomorrow's future. I want that future to be us. And it does mean we have to speak with clarity about our values, about who we are, about who our children are, what that future should look like, and how it should exist. I think that comprehensive sex education that is inclusive, that is racially informed, that is embracive of reproductive health rights and justice, that is the future programming that we need to have that teaches young people the skills, the tools, the information, the empowerment to lead lives for themselves in respectful harmony and affirmation of all of their peers. And who doesn't want that America? And we have to make sure that we are standing up and fighting for that America. For folks who are afraid, visit Delete Me. It is a privacy company for like $120. It will clear out all of your data so that you're not vulnerable to doxing, that you and your family are not vulnerable for doxing. Visit Educate Us, which is our 501c4 organization that just started. That is driving a sex ed voter campaign. They've got a Defend Sex Ed toolkit that talks about all of the intersections and programs and gives some messaging guidance. I want to thank all of our organizational partners who helped us put together the report Exposing Hate, and that's HRC and Advocates for Youth. And I don't have it up, so I don't know everybody, but thank you for showing up and helping us expose who these people are and why it's so important to know that, so that we can push back on this idea that somehow parents in America want a world in which only white kids get to show up in school and think that they can be proud of themselves. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening. This will be posted online to all the haters. We coming. So have a great evening. Thank you so much.